Welcome to the Long Way Through Scripture. I'm Catherine Schaefer. This is a slow walk through the Bible, not rushed, not pressured, just one section at a time, letting it unfold as it does. Each week, we're not trying to master Scripture, we're simply learning how to stay with it a little longer than we normally would, allowing the story to speak before we rush ahead. If you're following along and want something to help you process what you're reading, there is a companion workbook for this podcast. It's simple and steady, just something to help you reflect and stay grounded in the text as you go. You can find it in the show notes under books and resources. I'm really glad you're here, so let's begin. Week 22, Jeremiah and Lamentations. So, as we come to Jeremiah, we're standing near the end of a story that has been unfolding for centuries. The kingdom has been divided. Prophets have spoken, kings have risen and fallen, opportunities to return to God have appeared again and again, yet the overall direction has remained the same. The people have become increasingly confident in things that cannot ultimately save them, and the warnings that once seemed distant are beginning to feel uncomfortably close. What makes Jeremiah such a compelling figure is that he enters this moment with none of the confidence we might expect. When God calls him, Jeremiah immediately begins explaining why he isn't the right person. He feels too young, too inexperienced, too aware of his own limitations. There is something refreshingly honest about that response. Many people in Scripture seem larger than life when we first meet them. Jeremiah feels very human. God's answer is not to tell Jeremiah that he has underestimated himself. Instead, God reminds him that the calling does not depend on Jeremiah's strength. The message belongs to God. Jeremiah's responsibility is simply to carry it. That sounds straightforward until you begin reading what follows. Jeremiah spends decades speaking to people who largely do not want to hear what he has to say. He warns kings who dismiss him. He speaks to religious leaders who resist him. He addresses a nation that has become convinced everything will somehow work out regardless of the direction it continues to travel. One of the strongest themes in the book is misplaced trust. Again and again, Jeremiah exposes the things people have come to depend on instead of God. Sometimes it is political alliances. Sometimes it is military strength, religious activity. Often it is the simple assumption that because they are God's people, they are somehow immune from consequences. One image Jeremiah uses has stayed with readers for generations. He describes the people abandoning a fountain of living water and replacing it with a broken cistern that cannot hold water at all. For the people hearing these words, the image would have been immediately recognizable. Water meant life. A cracked cistern might look useful from a distance, but eventually it leaves you thirsty. Jeremiah's point is deeper than simple disobedience. He is showing what happens when people build their lives around things that were never designed to carry the weight of their trust. As you move through the book, you begin to realize that Jeremiah is not primarily concerned with outward behavior. He is concerned with the heart underneath it. The people continue participating in religious life. The temple still stands. Sacrifices are still offered. Festivals are still observed. From a distance, much of it looks familiar. That is why Jeremiah's temple sermon feels so shocking. He stands near the very place people believe guarantees their security and tells them that the building itself will not save them. They have confused the symbol with the reality. They have placed confidence in the existence of the temple rather than the God the temple was meant to point toward. It is a difficult message because it forces people to confront something uncomfortable. It is possible to be surrounded by the language of faith while slowly drifting from the God behind it. That tension is not limited to Jeremiah's generation. Every generation faces the temptation to trust structures more than relationship, familiarity more than obedience, routine more than genuine dependence on God. As the years pass, Jeremiah's life becomes increasingly difficult. He is mocked, opposed, ignored. At times, he is imprisoned. Other moments, he is treated as though he is the source of the nation's problems simply because he refused to stop speaking the truth about them. One of the reasons this book feels so personal is that Scripture allows us to see how deeply these experiences affect him. Jeremiah is not presented as a man who moved through suffering untouched. There are prayers scattered throughout the book where he pours out grief, frustration, loneliness, and exhaustion before God. Reading those passages can feel surprisingly modern because there's nothing polished about them. He speaks honestly, sometimes painfully honestly. Yet what stands out is that he keeps bringing those emotions to God. He does not walk away, stop praying, or listening. The honesty remains, but so does the relationship. That may be one of the most important lessons Jeremiah offers. Faithfulness is not pretending everything is fine. Faithfulness is continuing to walk with God when everything is not fine. Even in the middle of warnings, there are moments where the horizon opens and something larger comes into view. Jeremiah speaks about restoration long before anyone can imagine how restoration could happen. He describes a future covenant unlike anything the people have known before. God's law will not simply exist on tablets of stone, it will be written on hearts. Relationship, not merely ritual, sits at the center of what God promises. These chapters feel like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. The circumstances have not improved. The threat has not disappeared. Yet God is already speaking about what comes after the disaster. One scene captures this better than almost any other. Jeremiah is instructed to buy a field. On the surface, it seems like a terrible investment. The nation is collapsing. Jerusalem is under threat. Everything Jeremiah has been warning about is unfolding exactly as he said it would. Yet, he purchases land anyway because God tells him a day is coming when people will once again live there, build there, work there, and call it home. It becomes a quiet act of confidence in a future nobody else can see. Not confidence in circumstances, confidence in God. As the book moves towards its later chapters, the tension becomes impossible to escape. The warnings Jeremiah has carried for decades are no longer future events. Babylon surrounds Jerusalem. The city is under siege. Fear hangs over everything. What makes this portion of the story particularly heartbreaking is that Jeremiah is no longer trying to convince people. something might happen. He is watching the thing he spent years warning about finally arrive. The walls that once seemed secure cannot hold. The systems people trusted cannot save them. The assumptions they built their confidence upon begin to crumble. And then Jerusalem falls. The city is conquered. The temple is destroyed. The people are carried away. After spending years with Jeremiah's warnings, the reality lands with a weight that is difficult to describe. This is not simply a military defeat. It is the collapse of everything the people believed would always remain. Before Scripture moves forward into rebuilding, return, and restoration, it pauses. And that pause becomes the book of Lamentations. Before Scripture moves forward into rebuilding, and when we arrive at Lamentations, the pace changes completely. Up to this point, we've been following events as they unfold. Prophets have spoken, kings have made decisions, armies have advanced, warnings have been delivered. The story has been moving steadily towards this moment. Now everything stops long enough to acknowledge what has happened. Jerusalem has fallen, the temple is gone, families have been separated. The city that once stood at the center of Israel's identity now sits in ruins. What makes Lamentations remarkable is not simply that it records grief. Scripture contains sorrow in many places. What makes this book unique is that grief becomes the entire focus. Before the story moves forward, before rebuilding begins, before hope becomes visible again, the Bible gives space for mourning. That is not something we tend to do very well. Most of us want to move quickly through pain. We want answers, resolution. We want reassurance that things will improve. We want to know what lesson we're supposed to learn so we can continue on our way. Lamentations refuses to rush. The writer looks directly at loss and allows it to be named. The city is empty. The people are suffering. The future is uncertain. Nothing about this situation is minimized. As modern readers, that can feel uncomfortable because we're often looking for solutions. Yet there is something deeply wise about a book that pauses long enough to acknowledge what has been lost. Healing begins with honesty. Restoration begins with truth. The writer is not pretending things are better than they are. He is bringing the reality of the situation before God exactly as it exists. One of the things I appreciate most about Lamentations is that it shows us grief and faith existing together. Those two things are often treated as opposites. Sometimes people assume that if faith is strong enough, sorrow should disappear. Lamentations presents something very different. The writer is heartbroken. He is grieving. He is wrestling with what has happened. Yet he continues speaking to God throughout the process. The conversation never stops. That may be one of the most important lessons in the book. Faith is not the absence of grief. Faith is bringing grief into God's presence instead of carrying it alone. As the chapters unfold, there are moments where the writer describes loneliness, fear, uncertainty, and loss with remarkable honesty. Nothing feels polished, filtered. The words carry the weight of someone standing in the aftermath of disaster, trying to make sense of what remains. And yet, near the center of the book, something extraordinary happens. The circumstances have not changed. The city is still broken. The people are still suffering. Nothing has been rebuilt. But the writer deliberately turns his attention towards something that has not changed. He remembers who God is. That shift in focus is one of the most beautiful moments in all of Scripture because it doesn't happen after restoration arrives. It happens while the ruins are still visible. The words many of us know so well emerge from that place. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Those verses are often quoted by themselves, and rightly so. They are beautiful. But reading them inside Lamentations gives them an entirely different depth. These words are not being spoken by someone whose circumstances have improved. They are being spoken by someone standing in the middle of devastation. The writer is not looking around and seeing evidence that everything is going to be fine. He is looking beyond his circumstances to the character of God. That distinction matters. His hope is not rooted in what he currently sees, but hope is rooted in who God has always been. The more time you spend in Lamentations, the more you realize that the book never asks people to pretend pain isn't real. Instead, it shows what it looks like to remain connected to God while pain is still present. There is a difference between grief and hopelessness. The writer is deeply grieved, but he has not stopped turning toward God. He has not stopped praying, remembering, believing that God's faithfulness remains steady even when life feels unstable. That may be why this book continues to resonate with so many people. Most of us eventually encounter seasons that don't unfold the way we hoped. We experience losses we didn't choose. We face disappointments we didn't expect. We find ourselves standing in places where the future feels uncertain and the answers aren't obvious. Lamentations reminds us that God does not require us to skip over those experiences. He does not demand that we rush toward a conclusion or ask us to pretend we're stronger than we are. Instead, he invites us to bring the reality of our situation before him honestly. The book also teaches us something important about timing. Notice where it sits in the story. It comes before rebuilding, before return, restoration, before the people can see how God will continue his work. Scripture pauses long enough to acknowledge that grief deserves a voice. Only then does the story continue. As you read Jeremiah and the Lamentations this week, pay attention to the way these two books work together. Jeremiah shows us what faithfulness looks like when nobody wants to listen. Lamentations shows us what faithfulness looks like when the worst has already happened. One stands before the disaster and keeps speaking. The other stands in the aftermath and keeps praying. Together, they remind us that God's presence is not limited to seasons of victory and success. He remains present in warning, in sorrow, uncertainty, and in the long stretch between loss and restoration. The reflection to carry with you this week is this: faithfulness is not measured only by what happens when life is going well. Sometimes faithfulness looks like continuing to trust God's character when circumstances make very little sense. Jeremiah remained faithful while delivering a message people resisted. The writer of Lamentations remained faithful while grieving losses that could not be ignored. Neither book offers easy answers, but both remind us that God's faithfulness remains steady even when the future feels uncertain. And that is where this part of the journey leaves us. Not at the end of the story, but in a place where grief has been acknowledged, faith has remained intact, and hope continues to exist before restoration arrives. As you move into the reading this week, remember, there's no rush. Read slowly, read a little at a time, or simply sit with the passages if that's what the week allows. Scripture doesn't ask us to perform, it invites us to remain. And everything connected to this journey lives in the show notes. If you would like to help continue this show or this message, you're welcome to do that over on Patreon, all connected to the show notes as well. You can always find all the resources at catherineschaefer.com. Thank you for walking this long way with me. Long way with me. I'll meet you here again next week.